Well, I was 65 years old when my own son told me I had to leave. I had only $15 in my wallet and nowhere to go. That night, walking in the bone-chilling cold, I realized something my son had planned to destroy me. He'd been planning it for 5 years. But he didn't know the house my ex-wife left me in her will would become the most important thing I ever owned, not because of money, but because of what it taught me about survival redemption and a kind of love that asks nothing in return. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, please note this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message remains entirely true. We were in the living room of the house my ex-wife left me, the only thing she left me besides 30 years of memories and the particular ache of knowing I was never quite enough. Afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. It was the kind of light that made the room look like a photograph from someone else's life. Michael stood near the doorway, Jennifer slightly behind him. Their posture said they'd rehearsed this. Did he come? Michael began, his voice steady, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. You can't stay here anymore. I didn't understand at first. Not really. The house was mine. My ex-wife's will made that clear. But Michael explained, his tone never wavering, that there were debts. There were always debts. The cancer treatment had cost more than anyone expected. The house would need to be sold. And until it's sold, I couldn't live here. Where am I supposed to go? I asked. Michael didn't answer that. Jennifer looked away. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. November in Portland looks like the end of something. Gray sky, bare trees, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave until spring. I thought about my ex-wife, about how she'd left this house to me in her will, despite everything, despite the divorce, despite the years we spent growing into strangers. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was mercy. Either way, it was the last thing she gave me, and now it was being taken back. How long do I have? I asked. Today, Michael said. We need you out today. I nodded slowly. I didn't argue. There was no point. I was 65 years old, unemployed for 3 years, living on whatever remained of my savings. I had no leverage, no plan, no one to call. I went upstairs to the bedroom and pulled out a backpack I'd kept since my camping days, back when I still believed in adventures. I packed 3 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a toothbrush worn down to half its original size. At the bottom of a drawer, I found a photograph, my ex-wife and me, 20 years younger, standing in front of this same house on the day we bought it. We were smiling. We looked like people who believed things would work out. I folded the photo and placed it carefully in the backpack. When I came downstairs, Michael was standing in the living room. He didn't look at me. Jennifer had disappeared into another room. I'm taking $15 from the cash jar on the kitchen counter, I said. It wasn't a question. Michael didn't object. I walked to the front door. My hand was on the knob when Michael spoke. Dad. I turned. For a moment, I thought he might say something else, something that would change what was happening. But he didn't. He just looked at me, and then he looked away. I opened the door and stepped outside. The November air hit my face cold and sharp. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Michael was closing the door. And then came the sound I'll never forget, the deadbolt locking into place. Not loud, not violent. Just a small, definitive click that meant something had ended. I stood on the porch for a moment. My backpack slung over one shoulder, $15 in my wallet. A folded photograph of a life that wasn't mine anymore. The street was empty. A few cars passed. Nobody looked at me. Why would they? I was just an old man standing outside a house, and there was nothing remarkable about that. I started walking. I didn't have a destination. I just knew I had to keep moving because stopping meant thinking about where I was going to sleep, where I was going to get food, what happened to people like me when winter really set in. The city looked different when you didn't belong anywhere in it. The same streets I'd walked 1,000 times now felt like they belonged to other people. The coffee shops, the parks, the bus stops, they all had the quality of places I was passing through, never settling. By evening, I'd walked for hours. My feet hurt. My shoulders ached from the weight of the backpack. I found myself on a rural road at the edge of the city, where the buildings gave way to fields and the sky opened up. There was a house set back from the road, old and sagging, surrounded by overgrown property. No one had lived there in years. That much was obvious. I sat down on the curb across from it and watched the light fade from the sky. The house looked like something abandoned, like something the world had forgotten about. In the failing light, it seemed to match my mood, perfectly broken, forgotten, waiting for something that might never come. A car passed. Then nothing for a long time but the sound of wind in the bare trees. I pulled out the photograph of my ex-wife and me standing in front of our house on the day we bought it. Two people who believed in the future. Two people who had no idea how little time they had before everything would fall apart. What do you do when the only home you have left doesn't want you anymore? The cold hit me like nothing I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the November air, sharp and cutting as it swept down from the mountains surrounding Portland. It was the kind of cold that found its way into everything, that didn't just chill your skin, but worked its way deep into your bones, into your marrow. I'd felt cold before in my life, but never like this. Never with nowhere to go. I walked. There wasn't much else to do. The moment I stopped moving, the cold seemed to settle heavier, seemed to gain ground. So I kept walking my backpack, pulling at my shoulders, my feet moving one in front of the other, down streets I recognized, but no longer felt connected to. I'd lived in Portland for 30 years. I knew these neighborhoods, but tonight everything felt foreign. Everything felt like it belonged to someone else. The houses I passed were lit up from within windows, glowing warm against the darkness. I found myself drawn to them, drawn to the light, like some desperate moth. In one house, I could see a family gathered around a dinner table. A woman was laughing at something someone had said. A man sat across from her, and two teenagers were eating with their heads down, but they were smiling. A family. An actual functioning family eating dinner together on a November night. I stopped walking to watch. The woman looked up suddenly, straight toward the window, straight toward me, and I realized I was standing there like some kind of ghost staring in at their lives. I turned away quickly, my face burning despite the cold, and kept moving. This happened again and again as I made my way through the residential neighborhoods. Every few blocks, another house would catch my eye. A living room where an elderly couple sat watching television, her head resting on his shoulder. A kitchen where a man stood at the stove, cooking something that smelled incredible even from outside. A bedroom where a child was being read a bedtime story, the parent's voice rising and falling in exaggerated tones. All these worlds, all these small, ordinary moments of belonging, and me outside looking in. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the 3rd hour of walking. That wasn't a good thing. I knew enough to understand that numbness in your extremities wasn't a sign you were adapting to the cold, it was a sign that the cold was winning. My fingers had turned white, then blue, then a shade of purple I'd never seen before on human skin. I tried to make fists with them, tried to keep the circulation going, but they didn't respond the way I wanted them to. They moved like something separate from me, like puppet hands controlled by someone who'd had too much to drink. My feet were worse. I couldn't feel them anymore at all. I just knew they were still there because I was still moving, still putting one in front of the other, but the connection between my brain and my feet had been severed somewhere along the way. I was walking on autopilot now, my body doing what it needed to do to survive, while my mind floated somewhere above it all, observing detached. The streets were nearly empty. A few cars passed me, their headlights briefly illuminating the sidewalk before disappearing into the night. I thought about raising my hand, thought about trying to flag someone down, but what would I say? I was a 65-year-old man wandering the streets of Portland at night, with nothing but a backpack and $15. No one was going to stop. No one was going to care. Hours passed. I don't know how many. Time had stopped meaning much of anything. There was only the cold, the walking, the endless parade of lit windows and closed doors. My breath came in clouds now visible in the frigid air, and each breath hurt. The cold air scraped down my throat and into my lungs, leaving a rawness behind that made me cough. When I coughed, pain shot through my chest, sharp, bright pain that for a moment was almost welcome because at least it meant I could still feel something. The neighborhood gradually changed. The houses became smaller, older, set further apart. The streets emptied out even more. I was heading toward the edge of the city, toward the places where Portland dissolved into the countryside beyond. I didn't make a conscious decision to go this direction. My feet just carried me here, away from the neighborhoods, away from the families and their warm lights, toward something emptier and darker, and somehow less cruel in its indifference. By the time I reached the edge of town, I was barely coherent. The exhaustion had set in somewhere around midnight, I think, though I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that my legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete, that lifting my foot to take another step required a tremendous act of will, that the idea of lying down and just staying down seemed increasingly reasonable. There was a wooden bench near an old closed feed store. I sank onto it like it was the most precious thing I'd ever touched. The bench was hard, cold, and uncomfortable, everything a bench shouldn't be if you had to sit on it in November with only a thin jacket between you and the elements. But it was still. It was solid. It was a place where I could for a moment stop moving. I sat there in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged clouds, my whole body shaking with the kind of trembling that came from deep cold and deeper exhaustion. My backpack was still on my shoulders. I didn't have the energy to take it off. I just sat there, a 65-year-old man at the edge of a small city with nowhere to go, and nothing but time stretching out ahead of me, empty and infinite and terrifying. The night pressed down on me like a physical weight. When I managed to stumble a little further, I'd reached the outskirts where civilization finally gave way to wilderness. There was an old park nearby, closed for the season, its benches locked up for the winter. I collapsed onto a bench there, my entire body screaming in protest, and I understood with sudden crystal clarity what it meant to have nowhere to go. The cold had finally won. The morning came gray and cold, but it came. I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow, somewhere between collapsing at the edge of town and the first light of dawn, I'd managed to find shelter. It wasn't much, a recessed doorway behind an old shuttered storefront, the kind of place where no one would think to look. But it had blocked enough of the wind to keep me from freezing solid, and for that I was grateful. For that I was still alive. I'd woken stiff, my muscles protesting every movement, my fingers still bearing that faint purple tint from the previous night. But the cold had lifted slightly, not gone, never gone, but less immediate somehow. The sky was overcast, threatening more snow, but for the moment there was just gray light and the sounds of a city waking up around me. I needed to figure something out. That was the thought that kept running through my head as I stood shaking out my backpack, trying to get the blood flowing back into my extremities. I had one day, maybe two, before desperation completely took over. $15 wasn't going to last long. Shelter, food, warmth, all of it cost money I didn't have. I could already feel the clock ticking, already feel the pressure of time closing in. At 65 years old, with my body already worn down from a night of walking in November cold, I didn't have the luxury of time. I started moving through the downtown area, not because I had anywhere to be, but because staying still felt like giving up. I walked past coffee shops that smelled like heaven and cost money I didn't have. I walked past a shelter with a line of people outside it wrapped in blankets and holding plastic bags containing everything they owned. Was that going to be me in a month, a week? That was when I saw the bulletin board. It was outside the courthouse, a large corkboard covered with various notices and announcements. Eviction notices, job postings, community event flyers, the usual miscellaneous collection of information that accumulated on public bulletin boards in small cities. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, I was just walking past, but something made me stop. Something made me step closer. The list was handwritten on cream-colored paper, the letters neat and organized. County auction, unclaimed property. I read through it slowly, my eyes moving down the page. Old farm equipment, scrap land no one wanted, a pickup truck with no engine, various tools and building materials. Most of it was garbage, the kind of stuff that nobody would pay anything for, the kind of stuff people kept around, because getting rid of it was more trouble than leaving it to rot. But near the bottom, almost as an afterthought, there was one more item. Abandoned house outskirts of town. Minimum bid $15. I read it 3 times, not believing what I was seeing. An abandoned house. For $15. $15, which was exactly what I had in my pocket. It was impossible. It was ridiculous. It was the kind of thing that didn't happen in real life, the kind of thing that only occurred in stories people told to make themselves feel better about their circumstances. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. The bills were still there, wrinkled and worn, but still real. 1 $5 bill, 10 single-dollar bills. Exactly $15. Exactly the price of a house that no one else wanted. That was when I became aware of the people around me. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all looking at me with expressions I recognized immediately. The sideways glance, the barely suppressed smile, the way they glanced at each other like they were sharing a private joke. They were laughing at me. Not openly, not cruelly, but they were definitely laughing. I recognized the feeling because I'd felt it before, that particular sensation of being outside, of being observed, of being found wanting by the world around me. One of the men nudged the other and nodded toward me. The second man's eyes flickered down to where I was holding the auction notice, then back up to my face. His expression shifted slightly, pity mixed with amusement. I'd seen that look before, too. It was the look people gave to the homeless, to the desperate, to anyone who was openly struggling and failing. I looked back down at the paper. The house was described in a single line. No details about its condition, no information about what I'd be getting into, just the bare minimum required to put it up for auction. I had no idea what the building actually looked like. No idea if it was worth anything at all. No idea if it would even be suitable for shelter. But I also had no other options. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my pocket. Then I looked up at the people who were watching me, who were waiting to see what I'd do, who were expecting me to walk away embarrassed or to do something else that would justify their pity and amusement. I looked directly at them and I didn't look away. For a moment I saw something shift in their expressions. Whatever they'd been expecting, it wasn't this. It wasn't a man who acknowledged their judgment and met it with something like calm acceptance. It wasn't a man who seemed to have suddenly made a decision about something important. I looked back down at the paper in my hand, then at the money in my wallet, then back at the paper again. A strange calm had settled over me. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too fragile for what I was feeling, too dependent on external circumstances. It wasn't optimism either. I had no reason to believe that buying an abandoned house for $15 would solve anything. It wasn't even confidence, because I had no idea what I was doing or whether any of this would work. It was something simpler than all of that. It was the feeling of someone who had finally found something to do with his last $15 instead of just spending them on coffee or food or a few nights in a cheap hotel where the rooms smelled like other people's desperation. It was the feeling of someone who had taken one small piece of his circumstances and decided that he was going to do something with it, even if that something had no guarantee of success. It was the feeling of having made a decision, even if that decision was completely insane. I folded the auction notice more carefully this time and slipped it into my jacket pocket, the same pocket where I kept my photograph of my ex-wife. I didn't know when the auction would be held, didn't know how I'd get there, didn't know anything except that I had something now. Not hope, not a plan, just a possibility. And for the first time since Michael had locked the door behind me, I had something to move toward instead of just away from. The room smelled like dust and disappointment. It was the kind of space that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, drafty with high ceilings that seemed to swallow sound, and windows so thick with grime that the November light barely penetrated. A few folding tables had been set up at the front, and behind them sat a man in his 70s with a weathered face and tired eyes. The county clerk, I would later learn. For now, he was just the man who would decide the fate of whatever was being sold today. There were maybe 15 people scattered around the room. Mostly farmers, I guessed, based on their weathered hands and the way they carried themselves with the ease of men accustomed to outdoor labor. They wore thick jackets and boots, and they clustered together in small groups, talking quietly, occasionally, glancing at the auction list that had been printed and distributed to everyone who walked in. No one had glanced at me when I entered. No one seemed to notice that I'd arrived with nothing but the clothes on my back and desperate hope folded in my pocket. I stood alone near the back of the room, trying to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible. The clerk began reading from his list in a monotone voice that made even potentially interesting items sound boring. "Farm equipment," he droned. 23 acres of scrubland unsuitable for development. A few people raised their hands. Bids were made and quickly retracted. The items changed hands for prices that seemed barely worth announcing, and then the clerk would move on to the next thing. Time moved slowly. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. My palms were sweating despite the cold room, and I kept reaching into my pocket to make sure the auction notice was still there, that I hadn't somehow imagined it. The money was still in my wallet too, $15, exactly what I needed. I waited. The list continued. Old tools. Scrap metal. A truck with no engine. More land that nobody wanted. I watched the same farmers bid on item after item, watched them discuss their purchases among themselves, watched them treat this as just another Tuesday in their lives. For them, this was routine. For me, it was everything. Finally, the clerk looked down at his list, and I saw his eyes narrow slightly, as if he wasn't quite sure what he was about to read. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Abandoned house. He said, his voice still flat, still bored. Outskirts of town. Condition as is. Minimum bid $15. The room went quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that signified reverent attention. It was the kind of quiet that precedes laughter. I could feel it building in the room like pressure before a storm, could see the farmers glancing at each other, could see the slight movements of their shoulders that indicated they were working to contain their amusement. "Do I have a bid?" the clerk asked with the tone of a man who already knew the answer. No hands went up. $15. He tried again. "Do I have an opening bid of $15? Still nothing. I raised my hand. The laughter started immediately. It wasn't cruel, at least I don't think it was meant to be. It was the kind of gentle, amused laughter that men gave to foolishness they didn't quite understand, to decisions that made no sense in the world they occupied. I could hear it echoing off the wooden walls of the auction room, could see the shoulders of the farmers shaking slightly, could feel the weight of every eye in the room suddenly turn toward me. For a moment I considered dropping my hand. I considered walking out of that room and accepting that this was a sign that I was meant to fail, that the universe had just delivered a fairly clear message about my prospects. But I didn't. Instead, I said $15. My voice was louder than I'd expected it to be. Steadier. There was no hesitation in it, no questioning. I wasn't asking if it was okay. I was announcing a fact. The laughter died. The clerk looked at me with an expression of mild surprise. He'd clearly been expecting to have to ask multiple times to eventually call out a bid with no takers to move on to the next item. Instead, there I was, a man he'd never seen before, bidding on an abandoned house with the same certainty that the farmers around me bid on equipment and land they actually understood. "Any other bids?" he asked, looking around the room. The farmers didn't move. No one else raised their hand. No one wanted what I was offering for. "Sold," the clerk said, and he brought his gavel down with a sound that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. The wooden mallet connected with the wooden block, and suddenly, impossibly, I was a homeowner. The room moved on. The next item was being announced. People were already losing interest in me, already moving on to whatever came next. But I stood there for a moment, unable to quite process what had just happened. I'd walked into that room as a man with nothing. I was walking out, would walk out as a man with something. A piece of paper and a signature was all it would take. The clerk called me forward when the auction was done, and I approached the table with my heart still pounding. He had a deed ready, the legal documentation of my ownership. He explained the terms quickly, perfunctorily, clearly having done this hundreds of times before. I could own the property now. It was mine. The deed would be mine as soon as I signed it. A woman at the table offered me a pen, a cheap ballpoint, the kind you'd find in any office building in America. I took it with hands that had finally miraculously stopped shaking. My signature was uneven. I hadn't meant for it to be. I'd wanted to write my name with confidence, with the steady hand of a man who knew what he was doing. But my hands still had the tremor of cold and exhaustion in them, and so my name came out shaky and uncertain. Robert Harrison. My name on a piece of paper that said I owned something. That said I had a home, or at least the beginnings of one. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon light hit me like a physical thing. The sky was brighter than it had been in days. Clearer. As if the universe had shifted slightly to accommodate the fact that I'd just done something completely insane, and apparently I'd gotten away with it. The paper deed was folded carefully in my pocket right next to the photograph of my wife. I had something now. Not much. Not even probably something that would actually help in any meaningful way. But I had something, and that was enough. The deed in my pocket felt heavier than paper should. I walked for hours down a road that seemed to disappear into itself, the pavement cracking and giving way to gravel, then to dirt. The November sun was already sinking low, painting the sky in shades of gray and amber. Around me, the land opened up, no houses, no people, just fields that had seen better years and telephone poles that leaned slightly as if tired. This was the edge of things, the place where the town stopped pretending to be civilized. Then I saw it. From a distance, it barely looked like a house at all. It was more like a wound in the landscape, a dark shape against the sky, listing to one side the way a ship goes down. As I got closer, details emerged from the shadow, a roof that had surrendered entirely to time, with holes so large I could see daylight through them. Windows were missing panes, leaving empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. What remained of the paint had peeled away in long, papery strips, exposing the raw wood underneath, which had turned a sickly gray-brown. A porch sagged in the middle, its railing long gone, just a few nails bent like old fingers. I stopped at the property line and just looked at it. My house. Legally, officially, with a deed in my pocket. Signed by a county clerk in a room that smelled like dust and bureaucracy. $15. That was what I'd paid for this collapsing thing in the middle of nowhere. I moved closer. The grass was overgrown, choked with weeds that had grown so tall they nearly hid the foundation. Up close, I could see the rot more clearly wood, so decomposed it crumbled if I pressed against it, chunks coming away like bread that had been left in water too long. But underneath all that decay, when I pressed harder, there was something else. Solid. The core of the wood was still there, dense and strong, supporting everything even as its skin fell apart. I pushed open the front door. It didn't so much open as collapse outward, dropping onto the porch with a sound like a sigh. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, dampness and mold so thick I could taste it underneath, that the mineral smell of old wood and dust that had been settling for decades. A bird, maybe a sparrow, maybe something else, erupted from inside the house and shot past my head so fast I felt the air move. My heart hammered against my ribs. The floor beneath my feet was mostly gone. What remained was a combination of rotted wood and packed earth, soggy and dark. Water damage had moved through the room like a tide line, marking how high the flooding had reached at some point. The skirting boards had buckled and warped, curling up at the edges like dead leaves. I moved slowly through the main room, testing each step before putting my full weight down. Sunlight streamed through the holes in the roof, creating pillars of dusty light that made everything look like a place from another world. Fallen beams lay across the floor like dead giants. Debris scattered everywhere, pieces of old furniture, broken glass, attire, things so deteriorated I couldn't identify them anymore. But the bones of the house were still there. I pressed my hand against one of the interior walls. The exterior wall was thick. I'd seen it from outside, that substantial brick. Now, feeling it from inside, I could sense the weight of it, the structure. Under my fingers, I felt the rough texture of brick and then plaster beneath that. Below the obvious rot, below the surface damage that made everything look like it was dying, there was solid material. Heavy. Built to last. I stood there in that ruined room, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not hope exactly, I wasn't naive enough for that. But something like the absence of hopelessness. This thing wasn't a cardboard box. It wasn't a temporary shelter that would collapse the moment winter arrived. It was built. It had been made by someone who knew how to make things back when people still did that kind of work. The walls were a foot thick. The framework was solid wood, not the particle board nonsense they use now. Even broken, even rotting, even abandoned, it had integrity. I looked up through one of the holes in the roof at the darkening sky. I looked down at my hands, raw from the last few hours of walking, still shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline and whatever this feeling was. I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes. "Okay," I whispered into the gathering dark. "Okay." It wasn't much. It wasn't a promise or a plan. It was just acknowledgement that I was here, that this place was here, and that maybe, just maybe, we could figure out what to do with each other. The wind moved through the holes in the roof, and the house creaked around me like something waking up. That night I lay curled on the driest patch of earth I could find, my jacket spread beneath me like a prayer. The cold was a living thing. It didn't just surround me, it moved into me, settling into my bones, the way water settles into cracks. I'd known cold before. I'd lived through winters in Portland, had felt the bite of November rain and the sharp sting of frost on my face. But this was different. This was the cold of a place that had been abandoned, that hadn't held human warmth in years. The cold of a house that had given up. I curled myself tighter, pulling my knees toward my chest, trying to make myself into the smallest possible target. My breath came out in clouds that disappeared into the darkness. Around me, the house was full of sounds I couldn't identify and didn't want to think too hard about. Mice probably scratching in the walls, the wind moving through the holes in the roof, finding every gap and whistling through them like the house was an instrument being played by something invisible. the groaning of old wood beams settling or perhaps just complaining about their own decay. Every noise made me tense. Every shadow seemed like it could be something else, something with claws or teeth or worse, something with intentions. I don't know what time it was when I finally gave up on sleep. Maybe midnight, maybe 3 in the morning. Time moves differently in the dark stretches and contracts in ways that have nothing to do with actual minutes. I sat up, my shoulders hunched, my arms wrapped around my legs. The cold had made my muscles stiff, everything aching in a dull, pervasive way that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my body. My teeth were chattering. I clenched my jaw, trying to stop it, but my body wasn't listening to commands anymore. The shaking had taken over, a constant tremor that I couldn't control and couldn't quite believe was really happening. I was 65 years old, and I was sitting in an abandoned house in the middle of November, shaking like I was being electrocuted. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. But I couldn't quite find the energy for that, so instead I just sat there hugging my knees and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. At some point I became aware that I was crying, not dramatically, not with sobs, just tears that had started running down my face at some point without asking permission. I didn't try to stop them. What was the point? There was no one here to see, no one here to judge. Just me and the dark and the cold and the sound of the wind playing the house like a broken instrument. Around what must have been 4 in the morning, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not warmth, God, I wish it had been warmth, but something else. A kind of clarity, maybe. Or stubbornness. I'm not sure which. I sat up straighter, unwrapped my arms from around my legs, and looked out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. The clouds had rolled in, blocking out the stars, and the moon and the holes in the roof let in nothing but deeper shadow. But I looked out anyway, as if I could see past the dark to something beyond it. "You can do this," I whispered. My voice sounded strange in the empty house. Foreign. Like it belonged to someone else, someone braver than me. I said it again, a little louder. "You can do this." It wasn't true. I didn't believe it. The evidence against it was overwhelming: the cold, the dark, the fact that I was 65 years old and homeless, and had exactly $15 to my name and a deed to a house that was actively falling apart around me. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that I should walk out of this place right now and throw myself on the mercy of some shelter in the city, any shelter, no matter how crowded or degrading. But I said it anyway. "Jean, you can do this." I whispered into the dark, and something in my voice changed. It wasn't confident, I'm not delusional enough to claim that. But it was there. A thread of something. Not hope exactly. But not quite despair either. I wrapped my jacket around myself more tightly and lowered myself back down to the earth. I couldn't stop the shaking. I couldn't make the cold go away. I couldn't make the sounds stop or transform this broken place into something that resembled shelter. But I could lie here. I could endure 1 more hour, and then another, and then another after that. The wind kept howling. The mice kept scratching. The house kept creaking and settling and complaining in its ancient, tired voice. And I lay there on my jacket, wrapped up in myself like a cocoon, and I waited for morning. Somewhere in that long, frozen night, I realized something. It wasn't much of a realization, just a small, stubborn fact that I'd somehow managed to hold on to even as everything else was being stripped away. I was still alive. I was still here. And as long as I was still here, there was still a chance that tomorrow might be different from today. It wasn't much to hold on to, but it was enough. Morning came whether I was ready for it or not. I woke stiff and aching, every joint protesting. The cold had settled deep, but the sun was now visible through the roof holes, painting the ruins in pale gold. I moved slowly, testing each limb. Everything worked. Not well, but it worked. I stood and looked around. Debris everywhere. Rotted wood, fallen beams, broken glass catching morning light. The walls seemed more menacing in daylight, as if darkness had been kind enough to hide their damage. I had no tools, nothing but my hands and whatever I could find. I started with a wooden handle from a broom or rake, and used it to pull loose boards from the walls. Some came away easily, practically disintegrating. Others fought me, their nails embedded deep. The first stubborn piece required all my strength. I braced my feet, used my full body weight. For a moment I thought something in my back might tear. Then it shifted and momentum took over. It came free with a sound like a bone breaking. By noon my hands were bleeding. Small cuts from rough wood, scrapes from nails, blisters forming on my palms. One fingernail was torn half off. I wrapped it in old cloth and kept working. The alternative, stopping, giving up, wasn't an option. The work felt more important than the pain. It felt like the only thing holding me together. I found a piece of sheet metal and fashioned it into a shovel using a board as a handle. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. I scooped up debris, moving it to a corner. My shoulders burned. My lower back screamed with every bend. My legs felt wobbly from the constant effort. But I kept moving. The house demanded it. Every surface was compromised. If I stopped to think about how much work lay ahead, I would never continue. So I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just worked, pull, lift, carry, drop, repeat. By mid-afternoon, my fingers had swollen to nearly twice their normal size. My fingernails were blackened with debris and blood. My forearms ached with a deep bone-level soreness. I'd probably done real damage to muscles that hadn't worked this hard in years, maybe decades. I didn't let myself think about it. I found a thicker piece of wood, structural solid, and used it to lever up a large section of rotten flooring. It took everything I had. Sweat dripped despite the cold. My breath came in hard gasps. For a moment I thought my back might simply give out. But then the board came loose with a groan, and I managed to drag it to the debris pile. One board, one small section of the massive work ahead. But it was something. It was proof that this wasn't impossible. It was evidence that one old man with no tools and nothing to lose could accomplish something in this broken place. As the afternoon progressed, something strange happened. With each piece removed, each section of rotten wood pulled away, the space opened up. The room revealed its actual dimensions. There was more room than I'd realized. More potential. The walls, now visible without garbage obscuring them, seemed almost solid. Almost strong. The architecture underneath was still there, waiting. I was making progress. Small, almost impossibly small, but real. Visible. Undeniable. When the sun began to sink, painting the sky in orange and purple, I finally stopped. My entire body screamed. I was hungry, a deep, primal hunger that went beyond appetite. My hands were raw and swollen. My muscles were spent. My throat was dry from breathing dust. I found a relatively intact piece of wood and sat down hard. I leaned my head back against the wall and let my arms hang at my sides, palms up, so I could see the damage. Blood. Blisters. Dirt under the remaining nails. Then I took a breath. A long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest, somewhere I'd thought was broken. As I exhaled, something inside released tension I'd been holding since Michael and Jennifer told me to leave, since I'd walked into the cold Portland night with $15 and nothing else. I looked at my bloody hands, at the cleared space where debris had been, at the walls being revealed, at the bones of this broken structure that was starting to look almost like a house. "Okay," I whispered to the empty house. "We're really doing this." It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a desperate plea. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement. A commitment made to myself and to this place. Tomorrow would be harder. I knew that already. Tomorrow my muscles would be worse. Tomorrow the cold would bite deeper. Tomorrow I would wake up sore in ways I couldn't yet imagine. But today, I had worked. Today I had moved, and the house had responded. Today something that was broken had begun, however imperceptibly, to change. And that was enough. December arrived like an ambush. One day, I was still managing to work my hands raw, but functional, my muscles sore but willing. The next day, the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight and everything changed. The cold that settled over the house wasn't the sharp bite of November. This was something else entirely. This was a cold that didn't just sting, it invaded. It crept into the spaces between my bones and made thinking difficult. I woke before dawn on the first morning of true winter, and my hands were stiff. Not just sore stiff. I tried to flex my fingers, and they barely responded. The joints seemed locked in place as if the cold had welded them shut. I sat up slowly, trying to work some warmth back into them, rubbing my palms together, flexing and releasing over and over. It took almost an hour before I could move them without pain. The work that day was nearly impossible. I'd planned to continue clearing the eastern wall to remove more of the rotted skirting boards and expose the brick underneath. But the wood was frozen hard, and my numb fingers couldn't maintain grip on anything. A board I was trying to pry loose slipped from my hands twice. The third time I pulled harder, desperate to make progress despite the cold. That was when the beam fell. I didn't see it coming, not really. One moment I was focused on the board in my hands. The next there was a sound like a gunshot, a terrible crack that echoed through the empty room. Instinct took over. I dove to the side without thinking, and the beam crashed down exactly where I'd been standing, hitting the floor with a boom that shook dust from the remaining intact sections of roof. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might break through my ribs. I lay on the floor for a long moment, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, just staring at the massive piece of wood that had almost killed me. If my reflexes had been any slower. If I'd been distracted for one more second. I got up slowly, my legs shaking. The work stopped for the rest of the day. I couldn't focus, couldn't stop seeing that beam falling, couldn't shake the image of what would have happened if it had connected. But the cold and the danger were only the beginning. 2 days later, the snow started. Not a gentle dusting, a full, relentless snowstorm that filled the holes in the roof with white that pressed against the walls like something trying to force its way in. And everywhere the snow fell, water leaked. The melt found its way through cracks I hadn't even known existed. It dripped through the roof, pooled on what I'd managed to clear, and began undoing weeks of work. I stood in the middle of the room and watched it happen. A section of wall I'd carefully exposed began to darken as water ran down it. The floor I'd swept clean started to pool with water. All that effort, all those days of bleeding hands and aching muscles was being erased by something I couldn't fight. I couldn't battle the weather. I couldn't seal a roof that had holes the size of my fist. I couldn't stop the water from coming in any more than I could stop the cold from settling into my bones. I sat down hard on an overturned crate right there in the middle of the devastation. The house had been testing me since I arrived, but now it felt like it was fighting me. Every advance I made, it countered. Every repair I attempted, it undermined. The walls that had seemed so solid, so full of potential, now felt like they were actively working against me. The structure I'd believed in was crumbling not from my efforts, but from forces I couldn't control. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared at the water pooling on the floor. My hands were so cold, they'd turned grayish white. My toes had gone numb in my boots hours ago. My breath was coming in clouds so thick I could barely see through them. And I was sitting in a house that was actively falling apart around me. The thought arrived quietly, almost gently, I could leave. I could walk out of here right now, walk back into town, find a shelter, any shelter, no matter how crowded or degrading, get warm, get food, get away from this cold and this dying house and this impossible task I'd set for myself. What had I been thinking anyway? That a 65-year-old man with no resources and no help could single-handedly restore a condemned building, that willpower alone could overcome the laws of physics and thermodynamics and simple basic reality. The house had shown me the answer, and the answer was no. I sat there as the light began to fade, as the snow continued to fall, as the water continued to drip. I thought about the $15 I'd spent. I thought about Michael's face when I told him I was leaving. He'd probably smile. He'd probably think I'd learned my lesson, that I'd finally accepted my place in the world. Bottom. Alone. Worthless. The cold crept deeper. My body had long since stopped shivering. I'd read once that was a sign of hypothermia, that when you stopped shivering, it meant the cold was winning. I wasn't sure if that was true, but it felt true. It felt like everything was winning right now. The cold, the house, the winter fate, Michael, Jennifer, time itself. I looked at the door, the one that no longer hung properly, that sagged on its hinges. I could walk through it. I could leave all this behind. The fear came then, sudden and overwhelming. Not fear of the cold or the falling beams or the endless work. Fear of death. Real, primal fear. The kind that made me realize that if I stayed out here much longer, if I gave up and tried to walk into town in this storm without proper shelter or warmth or supplies, I might not make it. The cold would take me. I would freeze somewhere on the road, and they would find me in the spring, and that would be the end of the story. But if I stayed, if I kept trying, the cold might take me anyway. The house might collapse on me. The winter might simply overwhelm me through sheer force and duration. Either way, I was trapped, and neither option looked particularly like survival. I almost didn't see him at first. I was so focused on trying to seal a section of the roof with scraps of wood and old tar paper, a losing battle against the snow and wind, that I didn't notice the figure standing at the edge of the property until he called out, "You're going to freeze doing it that way." I nearly fell off the crate I was standing on. I turned around to see a man standing about 50 yards away, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of working outside. He wore a heavy coat and work boots, and he held a pair of gloves in his hand, like an offering. "Chef Ray Collins," he said, walking closer. "I own the hardware store in town." I didn't know what to say. I'd been in town exactly once since buying the house, and that was for the auction. The thought that someone from the community had noticed me, noticed my efforts here, had honestly never occurred to me. Robert and I managed. Robert Harrison. Ray nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. He looked at the house, at the patches of snow that had blown inside through the broken roof, at the debris pile I'd been working on for weeks. He looked at my hands, which were wrapped in old cloth stained with blood and dirt. "You're doing the work," Ray said simply. I respect that. It was such a small comment, so casually delivered, but it hit me harder than I expected. No judgment. No pity. No, "What are you doing with this condemned place?" Just recognition. Acknowledgement that I was trying. "I've been watching the progress," Ray continued. "From a distance. You know how word travels in a small town." He held up the gloves. "Thought you might need these." That was when I noticed the truck he'd left parked at the end of the drive. The bed was full of materials, boards, rolls of what looked like waterproofing tar paper, bundles of nails, and screws, coils of rope. Real materials. Good materials. The kind I could never afford on $15. "I can't pay you," I said immediately. The words came out defensive, almost angry. Pride, maybe. Or fear that this was some kind of trick. "I'm not asking you to," Ray said. He handed me the gloves. These are scrap from the store, things we throw out. The material's too damaged goods overstock stuff that's been sitting in the back. My father was a carpenter. He built things to last. He'd want this material to be used, not wasted in a landfill. Ray walked around to the truck and started unloading. I watched for a moment, not sure what to do. Then I moved to help him. Together we carried boards inside, laid out tar paper, organized the tools and supplies into neat piles in what had once been the kitchen area. "See the roof first," Ray said, and it wasn't a suggestion. "If you don't seal that, everything else is a waste of time." Over the next few hours, Ray showed me things. Not with long explanations, but by doing them and letting me watch. How to measure properly, measure twice, cut once, he said, and I realized these were words his father had probably taught him. How to cut wood at angles so it would fit flush against the wall. How to reinforce joints so they wouldn't shift when the temperature changed. How to work the tar paper so it would actually seal out water instead of just trapping moisture underneath. Ray's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He worked efficiently without wasted motion. Every action had a purpose. Every step built toward something solid. "You've worked with wood before," Ray said. It wasn't a question. Long time ago, I admitted. I didn't elaborate. Ray nodded as if that explained something. Maybe it did. Maybe my hands remembered things my mind had tried to forget. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fail, Ray showed me how to set up a temporary support system for the worst section of the roof. "This won't be permanent," he said, "but it'll hold through winter if you do it right. Come spring, we can do proper repairs." The word hung in the air between us. Ray said it so casually, like it was obvious that he'd be back, that we'd be working on this together. "My father built houses during the Depression," Ray said almost to himself. "Not fancy ones, just solid ones. Places where people could live. He always said that was the real work, giving people shelter, giving them a place to belong." Ray looked at me directly then. "He'd approve of what you're doing here. I'm sure of it." As the sun touched the horizon, Ray packed up his truck. He left behind most of the materials stacked neatly in the corner of what would eventually be my workshop. He left behind the gloves, which fit perfectly. "Get some rest," he said. "Your body needs it more than the house needs work right now." But after he left, after I watched his truck disappear down the road toward town, I found I couldn't rest. My body was tired, yes, exhausted actually, but something inside me had changed. The despair that had settled over me like a heavy blanket had lifted. There was work to do, yes. Real work, difficult work. But now I wasn't doing it alone. I found the oil lamp I'd salvaged weeks ago and got it working. I spent the night working on the roof section Ray had shown me, doing exactly as he'd instructed. My hands moved with purpose. My back didn't ache quite as much. The cold didn't bite quite as deep. Around midnight I stopped and looked at what I'd accomplished. It wasn't much, one section of roof partially secured, but it was solid. It was done right. It was the kind of work that would hold. I sat down on a board and held my hands up to the lamplight. They were still bleeding in a few places, still swollen, still scarred from weeks of work, but they were working. They remembered what to do. Outside, the wind still howled. The cold still pressed against the walls. But inside, under the flickering glow of the oil lamp, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Michael threw me out. I felt like I might have a future. He arrived on a Tuesday, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. I was working on reinforcing the eastern wall, the section Ray had shown me how to properly brace, when I heard the sound of a car engine. Not the old truck Ray drove, but something newer, something that didn't belong out here on this lonely road. I looked up to see a black sedan pulling up to the property line. The door opened and Michael stepped out. "My son," I hadn't seen him since that day in November when he'd pushed me out into the cold with nothing but $15 and the clothes on my back. He looked exactly the same as he had then, expensive coat, freshly pressed shirt, visible underneath hair styled carefully. The kind of man who belonged in an office, not standing in front of a half-ruined house in the middle of December. "Jesus," Michael said, walking closer, his eyes taking in the property with something between disgust and amusement. "You're actually living here in this rat hole." There was no warmth in his voice, no surprise tinged with concern, just contempt, pure and simple. "What are you doing here, Michael?" I said. My hands instinctively balled into fists. Ray had shown me how to relax my shoulders when working, how to let tension flow out through deliberate breathing. But there was no breathing through this. This was different. This was family, and family had the ability to make everything hurt differently. "So I'm just checking in on my poor old father," Michael said, but his eyes weren't checking in on me. They were scanning the house, taking inventory of the work I'd done. "Wanted to see if you were actually surviving out here, or if we'd need to plan a funeral soon." The casual cruelty of it barely registered. I was watching his face, trying to understand what he was really doing here. Michael didn't drive an hour out of the city just to insult me. There had to be a reason. There had to be something he wanted. "I'm doing fine," I said carefully. "Ray Collins has been helping me. The work is—" "Ray Collins!" Michael interrupted. He seemed to file that information away. "The hardware store guy. How quaint. Dad's got himself a little helper." I didn't respond. I just waited. Michael had never been good at comfortable silences. He always felt the need to fill them, to assert his dominance through words. "To look," Michael said, finally reaching into his coat. "I didn't drive out here for nothing. I've got something I need you to sign." He pulled out a document. Even from several feet away, I could see it was a legal form of some kind. Michael walked over and thrust it at me, his expression challenging. "What is this?" I asked, not taking it from his hands yet. "Say property transfer," Michael said. "I'm handling some estate stuff for the family. Jennifer and I thought it would be cleaner if we just got everything sorted out legally. You sign here and everything's in order." My stomach twisted. Everything about this felt wrong. Everything about his presence here, his tone, his urgency, it all screamed deception. I took the document, and my hands started shaking as I read it. It was indeed a property transfer. It was transferring ownership of this house, the house I'd bought for $15, the house that was mine, to Michael. The signature on the line was mine. My name. My handwriting. Except I'd never signed this. I didn't sign this." I said the words, coming out confused, almost questioning, like I was asking him to explain rather than accusing him of forgery. Michael's expression didn't change. "Of course you did. Last month. You were so upset about everything you said you didn't want the property anymore. You asked me to handle the sale. Don't you remember?" I didn't remember, because it hadn't happened. But the signature was perfect. Perfect in a way that chilled me, because it looked more like my handwriting than my handwriting did sometimes. Every loop, every angle, every pressure point was replicated with eerie accuracy. "I need you to sign here too," Michael said, pointing to a different line. "Just to confirm the transfer. This is the buyer's acknowledgement section. It just needs your signature confirming you've agreed to sell." I stared at the paper. I stared at my forged signature on the transfer line. I stared at the blank line Michael was asking me to sign. "No," I said. "No, I'm not signing anything." Michael's expression hardened. "Don't be difficult, Dad. This is already in motion. The buyer is waiting. All you have to do is sign one more line and this is finished." "No," I said again. I thrust the paper back at him. "Whatever this is, I'm not part of it." Michael took the paper, his jaw tight. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never quite seen before. Not just anger, something deeper, something more calculated. Something that suggested this moment, this confrontation, had been planned long before he ever got in his car to drive out here. "You're making a mistake," Michael said quietly. "You always were good at that, though. Making mistakes, making poor choices, making decisions that made everyone else's lives harder." He turned and walked back to his car. He climbed in, started the engine, and for a moment I thought he was just going to leave. But he rolled down the window and called out to me. "This isn't over, Dad, not by a long shot." Then he was gone, his sedan disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. I stood there in the cold, holding the image of that forged signature in my mind. My name, my handwriting. Perfect. Impossible. I stared at the space where his car had been. I stared at my hands, which were shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. I stared at the house behind me, at the work I'd done, at the life I'd been trying to build in the wreckage of the one Michael had destroyed. And then a thought arrived, quiet but insistent. This wasn't the first time. I couldn't articulate it yet. I couldn't point to specific moments or gather concrete evidence. But somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I'd been trying not to look for months, maybe years, there was a pattern. A history. A series of moments that had seemed like accidents or coincidence or just bad luck. But they hadn't been accidents, had they? I looked down at my hands again, at the scars and calluses and cuts from weeks of work. Then I looked at the paper Michael had left behind, lying in the dirt where I'd dropped it. I picked it up slowly. I studied that perfect forgery of my signature. And I made a decision. Whatever Michael was planning, whatever this was part of, I wasn't going to let it happen. Not this time. Not anymore. If you're still here, comment something, anything, so I know you're with me. If you were me right now holding a forged signature from your own son, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. Quick note, the story ahead includes some fictionalized details for narrative impact. Some elements aren't exactly as they happened. If you need to step back, I get it. But if you want to hear what Michael confesses next, stay. He came back before the sun had fully set. I was standing outside the house, staring at the forged document Michael had left behind, when I heard the car engine again. My first instinct was to go inside to lock myself away. But something stopped me. A hardness that had started forming somewhere deep in my chest, a resolve that refused to hide anymore. Michael pulled up with the same aggressive speed as before. But this time his face was flushed red. Angry. The kind of angry that comes from someone who isn't used to being told no. He got out of the car and walked straight toward me. No pretense this time. No fake casualness. "You think you're smart?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the empty landscape. "You think you can just refuse? I've got everything arranged, Dad. Everything. All you had to do was sign, and this would have been over." "Michael," I started. "Shut up," he said. His voice was cold now, the anger crystallizing into something worse. Something calculated. "Just shut up and listen." I shut up. 5 years ago. Michael said, pacing in front of me like a prosecutor in a courtroom. "I made sure your car would fail. The brake line, did you ever figure that out? That wasn't an accident. That was me. I spent 2 hours under that vehicle making sure you'd crash. Making sure you'd understand that you weren't welcome anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. The accident 5 years ago. I'd been driving to an interview for a job I desperately needed. The brakes had failed coming down a hill. I'd managed to steer into a ravine instead of hitting another car, but I'd broken 3 ribs and punctured a lung. I'd spent a week in the hospital. I'd lost the job. I'd thought it was just bad luck. "You did that," I said. My voice didn't sound like my voice. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away. I did, Michael said, and there was something like pride in his voice. And it would have worked perfectly too, except you're harder to kill than I expected. So I had to try other approaches. Kill. He'd said the word so casually, like he was talking about killing a spider, not his own father. Why do I ask? Michael stopped pacing. He looked at me with an expression that was part contempt, part something else. Something darker. Because, he said slowly, Mother left this house to you, not to me, to you. Do you understand what that means? After everything she said about being proud of me, about me being the successful one, the one who'd actually made something of himself, she left the house to you. The broken-down failure, the man who'd wasted his entire life. The words were cruel, but what hit harder was the resentment behind them. Years of it. Decades, maybe. Michael's entire life had been built on the foundation of being better than me, of proving he didn't need me, of showing that he'd succeeded where I'd failed. And then his mother, had looked at the two of us and decided to leave her house to the failure. I couldn't accept that, Michael continued. I couldn't accept that you'd get something I didn't, that you'd get anything at all. So I decided to take it from you, to take everything. Your dignity, your home, your life, all of it. That's insane, I said. Maybe, Michael said. But it's working, isn't it? Look at you, 65 years old, living in a condemned house with nothing but the clothes on your back and the charity of a hardware store owner. I've already destroyed you. I'm just finishing the job now. He pulled out another document. This one looked different from the morning's paper. More official, more final. You're going to sign this, Michael said. Right now. You're going to sign this deed transfer and you're going to sign it willingly. Because if you don't... He paused and his eyes went cold in a way I'd never seen before. If you don't, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to let you live in this house. I'm not going to let you have anything. And I'm not going to stop until you're dead. The threat hung in the air between us, concrete and absolute. You can't, I started. I can, Michael said flatly. I've been doing it for 5 years. I'm very good at it. And nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever suspect. You're just an old man in a falling-apart house. Who would care if you had an accident, a fire maybe? Something in the night. An old man who wasn't careful with a heating source. It happens all the time. He was talking about killing me. He was standing in front of me in the dying light of the December afternoon, and he was talking about murdering his own father. And the worst part was, I believed him. I believed he was capable of it. I believed he'd already tried. So what's it going to be? Michael asked. You going to be smart, or you going to be stupid? I looked at him. I looked at this man I'd raised, this man I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and driven to soccer games. I looked at the stranger standing in front of me with murder in his eyes, and something inside me broke free. No, I said. My voice was steady now, quiet, but steady. No, I'm not signing anything. And you can do your worst, Michael. You can burn this house down. You can try to kill me again. But I'm not giving up. Not now. Not ever. Michael's face went white with rage. For a moment I thought he might actually attack me, but instead he turned and walked back to his car. You'll regret this, he said as he climbed in. I promise you that. Then he was gone, his sedan disappearing down the road in the gathering darkness. I stood there in the cold, my entire body shaking. And I understood something with absolute clarity. Michael hadn't just tried to destroy me. He'd been systematically destroying me for 5 years. Every setback, every piece of bad luck, every moment I'd thought was chance, it had been deliberate. It had been planned. It had been Michael, and I'd survived it all. The shock of it should have broken me. The revelation of 5 years of deliberate sabotage of murder attempts, disguised as accidents of a son who wanted his father dead, it should have shattered me completely. But it didn't. Instead, something in me solidified. The same thing that had let me spend nights in a frozen house. The same thing that had let me pull rotted wood from walls with bleeding hands. The same thing that had made me say no to Michael's demands. Survival instinct, stubbornness, rage, pure clean anger. I picked up the phone, the old rotary phone I'd found in the house and somehow gotten working, and I dialed. Ray answered on the second ring. "I need help," I said. 3 days before Christmas, the work became everything. Ray arrived at dawn, the morning after I called him. I'd expected him to ask questions, to want explanations. Instead, he just pulled up in his truck already loaded with supplies and nodded like he'd been waiting for the call all along. "Michael came back," I said. "But I know," Ray said. "Small town, word travels. Besides, I knew something like this was coming." He knew. Somehow Ray had known that Michael would return, that the confrontation was inevitable. Maybe he'd seen it in me from the start, the bone-deep fear that something was going to be taken away again. We worked through that first day in a frenzy of purpose. Ray had brought materials, more tar paper, more nails, more lengths of wood that could serve as reinforcements. But what mattered most was his presence, his steady hands, his knowledge of where the weak points were, where the wind would find its way in, where the structure needed shoring up. We sealed gaps in the walls with tar paper and wood strips. We reinforced the joints where the roof met the walls, making sure nothing would shift when the pressure came. We worked on the eastern wall, the one that faced directly into the prevailing wind. Ray showed me how to brace it from inside, how to use the remaining interior supports to create a structure that wouldn't just stand against the storm, it would absorb the impact and redistribute the force. "The house wants to survive," Ray said at one point, running his hand along a beam. "We're just helping it remember how." I didn't eat much those 3 days. I'd find myself with a piece of bread or some soup in my hand, realize I'd forgotten about it, put it down half-finished. My body was running on adrenaline and purpose. Food felt like a distraction from the real work which was transforming this dying structure into something that could withstand what was coming. Because I knew what was coming. Michael had said it clearly: fire maybe, an accident, an old man not careful. The house had to hold. It had to survive. Because if it didn't, neither would I. The weather deteriorated with each passing day. On the 21st, it was just cold, the kind of brutal, deep cold that makes your lungs ache when you breathe. On the 22nd, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of snow. On the 23rd, the first flakes began to fall, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Ray and I worked through it all. We didn't talk much. There was a rhythm to the work, an efficiency that didn't require words. He'd hand me a nail before I asked for it. I'd brace a board before he needed to position it. We'd fallen into the kind of partnership where anticipation replaced communication. On the afternoon of the 23rd, Ray looked at the sky and said, "Tomorrow's going to be bad." I nodded. I could feel it too, the pressure in the air, the way the wind was starting to swirl instead of blow straight. The way the clouds were turning from gray to almost black at the edges. "The house is ready," Ray said. It wasn't a question or a reassurance. It was a statement of fact. We did good work. That night, we made sure everything was stored and secure. The supplies went into the corner of what would eventually be the kitchen. The oil lamps were filled and positioned. The water containers were full. Every movable object that might become a projectile in high winds was secured or moved inside. Ray left as the sun was setting on the 24th, Christmas Eve. "I'll be close," he said. "If you need anything." I knew what he meant. He'd stay within reach. He'd listen for sounds of trouble. He was telling me without words that I wasn't truly alone, that my call had made a difference, that I had an ally in this. After he left, I stood outside and watched the wind. It was starting to move the trees now, bending them at angles that looked wrong, impossible. The clouds were rolling in like something alive, something with purpose. I thought about Michael. I thought about his threat. I thought about fire in a storm, about an accident no one would question, about an old man alone in a failing house. But I wasn't alone. The house was ready. Ray was close. I had made a decision to stay, to fight, to refuse. And the storm was coming anyway. I went inside as the first real snow began to fall. Not the tentative flakes of the 23rd, but serious snow, the kind that meant business. I lit the oil lamps. I made sure the door was barricaded as much as I could barricade it, while still being able to open it if needed. I checked the roof supports, one final time, ran my hands along the joints. Ray and I had reinforced, felt the solid strength of wood that had been treated right. The wind began to howl as evening fell. It started as a whisper, almost gentle, but with each passing hour it grew. By 8 o'clock, it was a constant roar, pressing against the walls, testing every seam, every gap, every joint. The house creaked in response, old wood under new stress structure pushed to its limits. I sat in the center of the main room, wrapped in the jacket Ray had given me weeks ago, and I listened to the wind try to tear the house apart. There was a quality to that sound that I'd never heard before. It wasn't just wind. It was something more deliberate, more aggressive. It was the sound of something trying to destroy, and the only thing standing between it and me was this house, this broken, abandoned, supposedly condemned structure that I'd somehow managed to resurrect. The snow was piling up against the walls now. I could hear the impact of each flake multiplied 1,000,000 times until it became a constant percussion against the exterior. The wind found its way through a gap I'd somehow missed, and it whistled through the house like a voice, cold and insistent and threatening. But the walls held, the roof held, the reinforcements held, and somewhere in the night, as the storm reached a crescendo that seemed impossible, as the wind threatened to lift the entire structure off its foundation, I felt something crystallize inside me. I was going to survive this. The storm could rage. Michael could plan his fires and his accidents, but I was going to survive. I was going to be here in this house when the sun came up on Christmas morning, and I was going to be here long after Michael's anger had burned itself out. The wind screamed, the house held, and I held with it. The blizzard came with a fury that made the forecasters look like fools. By 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, the wind had stopped being wind and become something else entirely, a force that didn't just blow against the house but seemed to deliberately assault it, testing every joint, every reinforcement, every inch of the work Ray and I had done over those frantic 3 days. The snow fell so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows, and those windows themselves had become nearly opaque with ice and accumulated powder. I sat in the center of the main room, surrounded by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The house creaked around me, not in a way that suggested it was failing, but in the way a ship creaks when it's fighting through heavy seas. The structure was holding. The reinforcements were working. Everything we'd done was proving itself, and I was terrified, not of the house failing. I'd made peace with that possibility. What I was afraid of was the isolation, the sense of being locked away from the world, cut off from everything except this storm and my own thoughts. Thoughts that kept returning to Michael, to his threat, to the promise of fire in the chaos. Around 11, I heard something that cut through the wind. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me, creating patterns in the noise the way your brain creates faces in random images. But then I heard it again, a sound that didn't fit the wind's rhythm. A sound that was distinctly human. Someone was screaming. I got to my feet. The voice was distant, almost inaudible beneath the roar of the storm, but it was unmistakably a cry for help. Someone out there in the blizzard was in trouble. For a moment I hesitated. Every rational thought I possessed told me to stay inside, to keep the door closed, to preserve the warmth and shelter I'd worked so hard to create. Going out into that storm would be suicide. The cold alone would kill in minutes. Disorientation would set in immediately. I could stumble off the road and never be found until spring. All of that was true. I opened the door anyway. The cold hit me like a physical assault. It wasn't just cold. It was alive, aggressive, determined to force its way into my lungs and my bones and my blood. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and the snow was so thick I literally couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. "Hello," I shouted, though I couldn't hear my own voice beneath the roar. "I'm here, follow my voice." There was no response, just wind and snow and the distant sound of what might have been crying. I stepped away from the house. That was the hardest part, leaving the shelter, walking away from the one place of safety in a landscape that had become hostile and deadly. My eyes were watering from the cold before I'd taken 10 steps. My breath was coming in gasps that felt like they were tearing my lungs apart. My fingers were already going numb in my pockets, but I kept moving forward, calling out, trying to navigate by the sound of the voices I'd heard. The snow crunched under my feet, with a sound like breaking glass. The wind seemed to come from every direction, at once trying to push me back toward the house, or off into the trees, or simply down into the drifts, where I would disappear entirely. My mind started playing tricks. Distances became impossible to judge, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, and then the shapes began to emerge from the white. At first they were just shadows, suggestions of form in the endless snow. But as I got closer, they became more solid, more real. 3 figures huddled together, 2 larger ones, and 1 smaller, all bent against the wind, all moving with the desperate slowness of people reaching the end of their endurance. A woman, a man, a boy, maybe 13 or 14 years old. They didn't see me until I was almost upon them. When they realized there was another person there, they nearly fell over in what I assumed was relief. "Come on," I shouted, though I wasn't sure they could hear me. I grabbed the woman's arm. She was so cold, her skin felt like ice through her jacket, and I started pulling them back in the direction of the house. "We got lost," the man called out, but his words were nearly inaudible. "Our car." "Don't talk," I said. "Save your breath, just come." The walk back to the house was the longest walk of my life. What should have been maybe 50 yards felt like miles. The boy stumbled several times, and I had to half carry him. The woman kept looking back over her shoulder, and I realized they were probably looking for their car, trying to remember which direction it was. But there was no direction. There was nothing but white and wind and cold that wanted to kill us all. Then impossibly, I saw light. The oil lamps I'd left burning inside the house were visible through the blizzard, not clear, not bright, just a faint glow that marked the difference between absolute darkness and the storm's white chaos. I pulled the family toward that light. We stumbled through the doorway together, and I slammed the door shut behind us, cutting off the howl of the wind. For a moment, we all just stood there, dripping melted snow on the floor, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The boy was shaking so hard, his teeth were chattering audibly. The woman, his mother, I assumed, had her arm around him. The man was staring at the reinforced walls and the secured roof like he couldn't quite believe he was inside a structure that seemed to be actively holding against the storm. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I thought we were lost, and I thought—" "You're safe now," I said. And then, because it seemed important to establish something in that moment, I added, "My name is Robert. Welcome to my house." Outside, the storm raged on. Michael was still out there somewhere, his threat still hanging over me like a sword. But for this moment in this space I'd built with my own hands, there were people I'd pulled from the darkness, and they were alive. That was enough. More than enough. Getting them inside was one thing. Keeping them alive was another. The boy was the worst. His lips had turned a bluish white, and his eyes were only half open, staring at nothing. His mother kept rubbing his arms, trying to generate warmth through friction, but he wasn't responding to her voice. The father was in slightly better condition. He could at least move his limbs, could at least understand where he was, but he was shaking so violently, I thought his teeth might crack. The woman looked at me with an expression that was part desperation, part plea. "Please," she said. "Please, he's not... I don't know if he's going to be okay." I said, and I meant it. I'd grown up in the kind of winters where hypothermia wasn't theoretical. I knew what to do. "We need heat, slowly, not too fast." I moved quickly through the house, which had become familiar enough that I could navigate it almost by instinct. I built up the fire in the old stove to a safe but steady level, hot enough to warm the space, not so hot that it would shock their systems. I pulled out every blanket I'd managed to salvage over the past weeks, every scrap of dry fabric I could find. The mother helped me, following my directions without question. The father eased himself down onto a piece of wood I'd positioned near the fire, his body still shaking, but his mind beginning to engage with reality. "The car is out there," he said, his voice slurred. "We need to..." "The car can wait," I said. "Right now we focus on staying alive. We can worry about the car when the sun comes up." I worked on the boy. His mother held him while I carefully removed his wet jacket and sodden layers. His skin was cold, not just cool, but deeply, profoundly cold, the kind of cold that suggests the body has almost given up its fight. But he was breathing. His heart was still beating. He was still fighting, even if he didn't know it. I wrapped him in the driest blanket I had, then wrapped it again with another one. I positioned him closest to the fire where the heat would reach him most directly. His mother sat beside him, whispering reassurances that he couldn't hear. "What's his name?" I asked. "Owen," she said. "His name is Owen. He's 13. He's such a good boy, he never complains, and I just..." Her voice broke. "I thought we were going to lose him." "You're not going to lose him," I said. It was a promise I was making to her and to myself and to something larger than both of us. "He's going to be fine." I brought hot water, not scalding, just warm, in one of the metal containers I'd salvaged. I offered it to the father first. He drank slowly, carefully, and I watched the warmth begin to return to his face as the liquid spread through his system. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for I don't even know what I'm saying." We were lost. We were going to die out there. You saved our lives. The mother continued whispering to Owen, her hands never leaving him. The father wrapped his own blanket tighter and stared into the fire like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. An hour passed, then another. Gradually, Owen began to respond. His eyes started to focus. His breathing deepened. His mother saw it before anyone else, the moment when consciousness truly returned, when he understood that he was inside, that he was warm, that he was alive. The woman started crying, not the quiet tears of relief, but the kind of deep, shaking sobs that come from a place of absolute gratitude and absolute terror realized in retrospect. She held Owen against her chest and cried like her body was releasing everything it had been holding for the past hours. The father reached over and squeezed my shoulder. His grip was strong now, the warmth returning to his hands. "I'm Mark," he said. "That's my wife, Laura, and that's our son, Owen. He paused, looking for words. "I don't know how to thank you. We were going to die. All three of us. Another 10 minutes in that storm and we would have been dead." "You're not dead," I said simply. "You're here. You're warm. You're alive." Owen's eyes found mine for the first time since we'd come inside. He was still shaking, still recovering from the cold, but awareness had returned. understanding had returned. He was a boy who'd looked death in the face and survived it. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice hoarse from cold and crying. "Robert," I said. "Thank you, Robert," Owen said. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he began to cry, not sobs like his mother, but the quiet tears of a young person who'd just realized how close he'd come to not existing anymore. Laura held him tighter. Mark kept his hand on my shoulder, and I sat with them watching the fire, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just a man who'd survived. I wasn't just a man who'd built a house and learned to work with his hands again. I was a man who'd gone into a killing storm and brought people back from the edge of death. I was a man who had a purpose that extended beyond myself. I was a man who'd created a space where life could be preserved and nurtured and protected. And right now, 3 people who should have been frozen corpses in a field somewhere were instead sitting by my fire, alive and warm, and beginning to understand the magnitude of their rescue. "You should rest," I told them. "It's still hours until dawn. The storm might continue all night. But you're safe here. The house will hold. I'll keep the fire going." Laura nodded, her tears finally beginning to slow. "I don't know how to thank you," she said again. "You already did," I said. "You're alive. That's enough." But it was more than enough. It was everything. Owen cried quietly against his mother's chest, and the sound, that small, weak, living sound, was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in a very long time. The family stayed for 2 more days. Owen actually smiled on the morning of the 2nd day. A real smile, genuine joy at being young and warm and alive. When they left on the 3rd morning, Mark shook my hand for a long time without speaking. Laura hugged me with tears streaming down her face. Owen held my arm and said, "You're a good man, Robert. Don't let anyone tell you different." Within hours, word had begun to spread through the town. The same people who'd laughed at me at the auction, who'd called my house an ochut, began showing up at my door with offers of help. A man named Tom arrived with a truck full of good materials. A woman named Sarah organized a team to help with repairs. An electrician named James offered his skills. Within a week, the narrative had flipped completely. I wasn't the failure living in a condemned house. I was the man who'd risked death to save a family. I was the man who'd taken an abandoned structure and transformed it through determination. I was the man who'd proven that it wasn't about where you came from. It was about what you chose to do. But the transformation went deeper than community support. About 10 days after Mark and Laura left, there was a knock on my door. A police officer stood there. "Robert Harrison," she said. "We've received reports about fraudulent documents and property theft involving Michael Harrison and Jennifer Harrison. We need your statement." I was willing. The police investigation moved faster than I expected. They had the forged documents Michael had left behind. They had my testimony about the coercion. They had the property deed showing the house belonged to me. They had bank records showing Michael's financial desperation. And then they found evidence of the car, 5 years ago. The brake line sabotage. There was a mechanic's report from my accident, and when they dug deeper, they found records that Michael had taken my car to a shop the week before. A shop owner who still remembered Michael asking specific questions about brake maintenance. The pattern was exposed. 5 years of deliberate destruction, attempted murder disguised as accident, systematic fraud, and now the final play, stealing the house through forged signatures. Michael didn't fight it. When police came to arrest him, he went quietly. Jennifer tried to deny involvement at first, but evidence was overwhelming. Both were charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted property theft. I watched from a distance as my son, the man who'd tried to destroy me, who'd sabotaged my car with the intent to kill, who'd systematically worked to erase me, was finally held accountable by a system larger than our family dynamics, larger than his arrogance, larger than his resentment. The police officer shook my hand when it was over. "You did the right thing," she said. "Most people wouldn't have had the courage to press charges against family." "I didn't fight back," I said. "I just lived. I just survived. The fighting back happened because I chose to build something instead of destroy something." She nodded like she understood exactly. Ray came by the house the day after Michael's arrest. He simply sat with me for a while, not needing to say much. Finally, he said, "Your father would be proud that he raised a son who could go into a storm to save strangers. That's what matters. That's what lasts." I thought about Michael sitting in a cell somewhere, finally facing consequences. I thought about the 5 years of deliberate harm, the countless cruelties, the systematic attempt to destroy me. I thought about how it had all been exposed, not through my rage or my need for revenge, but through evidence and community witnesses and a legal system that actually worked. And I realized something that surprised me. The victory didn't taste like I'd imagined. I'd expected triumph. I'd expected satisfaction. I'd expected to feel like I'd won, like I'd beaten Michael, like I'd proven myself superior. Instead, what I felt was something else entirely. Something quieter. Something deeper. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about the fact that I'd stayed. I'd chosen to build instead of destroy. I'd chosen to help instead of harm. I'd chosen to let the legal system and the community do the judging instead of taking revenge. Michael had tried to annihilate me, and he'd failed not because I was stronger, but because I'd chosen to become something he couldn't destroy. I'd chosen to build a house. I'd chosen to rescue a family. I'd chosen to offer warmth instead of seeking cold revenge. That was the victory. Not Michael in a cell, though, that was justice. But the understanding that I'd become a man worth saving not by anyone else but by myself. January turned to February, and the grip of winter began to loosen. The snow melted, revealing the work Ray and I had done. The reinforcements held perfectly. The roof didn't leak. The walls stood firm. The house had survived, and it was still standing. I realized something had shifted inside me as well. The raw desperation that had driven me through those early months had transformed into purpose that extended beyond myself. I began planning a new room. On the southern side of the house, where afternoon light naturally gathered, I started framing out a guest room, simple, clean, warm. A place where people who found themselves lost or desperate could come and find shelter. I worked slowly, remembering everything Ray had taught me, building it right. The community continued to help. Tom came by with materials. Sarah brought her team to help with framing. James made sure the electrical work was done safely. They didn't come because they owed me anything. They came because they understood what the house had become, not just a shelter for one old man, but a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to give up. "You know what people are calling this place?" Sarah asked one afternoon. "The lighthouse," she said. "Because you keep the light on." I hadn't realized how visible it was from the road, the lamp in my window, that I kept burning through the cold nights. It had become a signal, a beacon, a way of saying, if you're lost out there, there's warmth here. There's shelter here. There's someone who understands what it's like to be alone in the dark. By early March, the guest room was finished. Simple bed blankets, a small stove, a window toward the road. Ray came by and nodded his approval. "Your father would have loved this," he said. "I keep thinking about that," I said. "About what it means to build something that helps people. I spent so many years just trying to survive my own life. Now I'm building rooms for people I don't even know yet." "That's what matters," Ray said. "That's the real work." As March gave way to April, real warmth arrived. The world outside began to come alive. Trees budded. Birds returned. The frozen earth softened. And with that renewal came a realization. I'd been kicked out with $15. I'd nearly frozen to death. I'd faced a son who wanted me dead. I'd learned to work with my hands, to build, to create shelter from nothing. And now I had a house. I had a community. I had purpose that extended beyond my own survival. More than that, I had become a beacon for others. People began to appear at my door as spring deepened. A woman fleeing an abusive situation, an older man whose car had broken down, a teenager who'd run away from home scared and lost. Each found the lamp lit in my window. Each found shelter. Each found what they needed: a bed, a meal, warmth, or just the knowledge that someone else understood what it felt like to be desperate and alone. I never asked for their stories. I never demanded gratitude. I simply offered what I had: the house I'd built, the warmth I'd created, the light I kept burning. And each one, when they left, carried with them the knowledge that there was a place, a lighthouse on the edge of Portland, where people who'd been cast out could find shelter. One evening in late April, I stood outside my house and looked at it the way I might look at a stranger. The eau chute that people had mocked at the auction. The condemned structure that was supposed to be worthless. The broken thing that I'd poured months of blood and sweat into rebuilding. It was beautiful, not in a conventional way. The walls weren't perfectly straight. The roof had patches. The wood was weathered and worn. But it was solid. It was strong. It was real. And it was full of purpose. I thought about the boy I'd pulled from the blizzard. I thought about the woman who'd stayed in the guest room safe. I thought about the teenager who'd discovered that someone still believed he was worth saving. I thought about Michael sitting in a prison cell facing consequences. And I thought about the man I'd become, not the victim who'd been thrown out into the cold, but the man who now kept a light burning for others in the dark. The lamp glowed in the window as evening fell. Spring birds sang in the trees. The world was warming and growing and coming alive. And somewhere out there, lost and desperate and afraid, someone would see that light and know there was a place they could go. There was a lighthouse, and I was keeping it lit. Years later, people still talk about that house on the edge of town. It's become something of a local legend. The story of the old man who bought a condemned property for $15 and transformed it into a sanctuary. The details have grown in the retelling, embellished by time and distance, but the core remains the same. A man who'd been cast out into the cold chose to build instead of despair. A man who'd nearly frozen to death chose to keep a light burning for others. I'm not sure when exactly I became a symbol. It wasn't something I planned for or sought. I simply kept doing what seemed necessary, maintaining the house, welcoming people who needed shelter, tending the lamp that burned in my window through the winter months. But the community noticed. What surprised me most wasn't the recognition I received, though I received it. What surprised me was what happened around me. Other people began to shift their choices, inspired by what they'd witnessed. A man's refusal to give up a community's decision to support him. They started helping others. Tom began volunteering at a food bank. Sarah started a program for women in crisis situations. James donated his time to help fix people's homes for free. The town changed. Not dramatically, not overnight. But gradually, the indifference that had characterized the community transformed into something warmer. Compassion became the default, not the exception. People looked out for each other. People helped. People remembered that we're all one crisis away from being desperate and alone. I never remarried. I never sought any kind of fame or recognition beyond what naturally came. I simply continued what I'd started, maintaining the house, keeping the lamp lit, offering shelter to those who needed it. Ray passed away a few years after the winter of my rescue, but his legacy lived in every board I placed, every joint I reinforced, every person I helped, because that's what mattered. Not my story, not my triumph over Michael or my vindication by the community. What mattered was the light. And one day I realized I should ask the question directly. If you were me, 65 years old, kicked out of your home with $15 in your pocket and nowhere to go, what would you do? Would you have given up? Would you have let the cold and the darkness and the despair win? Or would you have found that condemned house and chosen to fight? More importantly, What is your $15 house? Because I believe everyone has one. Everyone has something that's been abandoned or rejected or deemed worthless. Everyone has a crisis point where they have to choose between giving up and building something from the ruins of what they've lost. For some of you, it might be an actual house, a physical structure that needs rebuilding. For others, it might be a relationship that's fallen apart, a career that's collapsed, a sense of self that's been shattered. It might be an addiction you're fighting or a trauma you're healing from, or simply the knowledge that you've been treated as disposable and cast aside. Whatever it is, that's your $15 house. And the question isn't whether you can fix it. The question isn't whether you deserve better or whether the odds are against you. The question is simply, are you willing to stay? Are you willing to face the cold? Are you willing to do the work day after day, even when it seems impossible? Are you willing to ask for help when you need it and to give help when others need it? Are you willing to transform your survival into purpose? Because that's what changes everything. Not the rescue by the community, though that matters. Not the justice when Michael finally faced consequences, though that mattered too. What changes everything is the moment you decide that your life means something beyond your own survival. The moment you understand that the light you keep burning isn't just for you, it's for everyone lost in the dark. I've watched people come to my door over the years. Some stay for a night. Some stay for months. Some come back years later to tell me they've built their own houses, now their own sanctuaries. They've found their own light to keep burning. That's the real victory. Not my house, but the houses they've built. Not my light, but the lights they've kindled in their own windows. Because sometimes the smallest light can guide someone through the darkest winter. A lamp burning in a window. A hand extended to a stranger. A choice to build instead of destroy. A decision to offer warmth instead of seeking revenge. These small things, these impossibly small things, have the power to transform not just one life, but an entire community. So find your $15 house. Find that thing that's been rejected or abandoned, that seems worthless or impossible to fix. Look at the ruins of what you've lost or what's been taken from you, and ask yourself, what could I build here? Don't look for the perfect plan. Don't wait for conditions to be ideal. Don't demand that the world make it easy for you. Just start. Just begin the work. Just put one board in front of another, one nail after another, and build something real. And when you've built your sanctuary, when you've transformed your survival into purpose, when you understand that your life means something beyond your own preservation, light a lamp. Keep it burning. Let it shine in the window for everyone else who's lost in the dark, because that's what we're all looking for. Not rescue, though rescue matters. Not triumph, though victory has its place. What we're all seeking is proof that it's possible. Proof that someone else has stood where we're standing and chose to keep going. Proof that light exists in the darkness. That's what my house became. That's what the lamp in my window means. Not a monument to one old man's stubbornness, but a lighthouse for anyone brave enough to keep searching for the shore. Looking back at this story, at my own life, I've learned something I wish I'd known sooner. I was so broken, so consumed by what I'd lost, that I almost missed what I was being given. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're standing alone in the cold to realize your worth. Don't let shame keep you from asking for help. Don't let bitterness poison the second chances that come your way. I learned that sometimes God whispers through ordinary people, through a man like Ray, who shows up with materials and asks nothing in return. Through a family lost in a blizzard, who reminds you that your struggles aren't about you anymore. God was speaking to me all along. I just had to stop and listen. This is what I learned. A man can lose everything and still have something to rebuild. God doesn't abandon us in our darkest winters. He sends us light. Sometimes it's a lamp in a window. Sometimes it's a stranger's kindness. Sometimes it's simply the choice to get back up. So here's my question for you. Have you lost something you thought was irreplaceable? Are you standing in your own cold night, wondering if there's a way forward? There is. Share your story in the comments. Let others know they're not alone. Subscribe and hit that bell because these stories matter. They remind us that we matter. Thank you for staying with me to the end. Your presence meant everything. One final note. The journey you've witnessed includes some elements shaped for narrative depth and educational impact. Some details have been reimagined. Some conversations reconstructed. If this resonates with you, wonderful. If you need content that's different, that's okay too. Choose what serves your heart. God bless you all.